Crazy for You, a controversial romance. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Laura Ramade. Prologue. 1988. New York City. The interview wasn't going well. Not from Roxanne's point of view. She knew Lauren Weber's reputation as a talk show host. In a word, Barracuda said it all. This came as no surprise to Roxanne, and now she wondered how she'd ever been talked into this. If Lauren's guest had anything to hide, she had a way of tempting those skeletons out of the closet. And Roxanne had plenty to hide. Plenty that could tarnish her public image of sweet and innocent. This is all Walt's fault. Roxanne's publicist had convinced her it would be good publicity for the new movie. Initially, his argument had been a good one. Lauren Weber was the most popular talk show host around, and this would be a nice plug for the new movie since millions of people would see the clips. Walt had been adamant, so reluctantly and against her better judgment, she'd agreed to let America's favorite talk show host interview the renowned authoress-actress Roxanne Simon. "What can you tell us about Garrett Hollander?" Lauren's questioning voice brought Roxanne back to reality. She didn't falter at the mention of the ever-popular rock band. "Well," Roxanne said, "I don't know what I could tell you that you don't already know." "Isn't it true that you and your sister Candy knew them when they were nobody?" "I've never thought of Frank or Rich as nobody." "Isn't Frank Garrett the father of your son?" The audience reacted with a mixture of gasps and whispers. Roxanne laughed skeptically. "Whatever gave you that idea?" "Well, his name is Frankie." "Frank is my father's name," Roxanne said with all the repose expected of someone with 2 Best Actress Oscars under her belt. Lauren took on one of those looks that said she knew she was getting nowhere. But Roxanne wasn't falling for that. Lauren Weber was regrouping, and Roxanne Simon would be ready. "Your latest movie," Lauren said, changing the subject. "Bad Company" was released last week, and it's doing well at the box office. She paused briefly, allowing the audience time for applause. "And rumor has it that it'll be nominated for multiple Academy Awards." "Well, I think it's a little early to be supposing about the Oscars," Roxanne declared. "You're no stranger to the Oscars," Lauren said. "You've won awards before. Aren't you getting used to collecting them by now?" "I'll never get so used to it that I'll take something like that for granted," Roxanne said meekly of the Oscars. "I'm always grateful for any recognition of my work." Roxanne was surprised at how cool she'd managed to remain. Lauren had invaded territory that was better left alone. Territory known for bringing out Roxanne's weaknesses. "What's next?" Lauren's voice remained casual. "A vacation?" Roxanne said and dropped it at that. The time had not come for the public to know she'd started working on her autobiography. "Devoting some time to your son?" "Yes." "Is he here with you?" Apprehension bundled up inside Roxanne, but she wouldn't lie. In the past, her lies had had a way of biting her on the butt. "Yes, he is." "Could we bring him out?" Shit. Through the years, Roxanne had successfully protected Frankie from the press. Not one photograph of the child had ever been published in any newspaper or magazine, but America was going to get a look at him now. If Roxanne refused to let him come out, the audience would know she had something to hide. That news could get back to Frank. On the other hand, if she did let him come out, then Frank might see him. Yet there was no real choice in the matter. Refusing to bring him out would cause a much bigger fuss. "If he wants to come out," Roxanne said. "But Miss Weber, please understand." Her tone issued an unmistakable warning. "I wouldn't want his head filled with any foolish ideas." That probably wouldn't stop Lauren, but hopefully a sense of decency would. Lauren didn't have to tell Frankie she thought Frank Garrett was his father to get her point across. The implication would be more than enough. Roxanne's 4-year-old son ran across the set and climbed into a chair that had been placed between the talk show host and her guest. Frankie looked at Roxanne for direction. "Hi, sweetie." Roxanne smiled at the boy. "This is Miss Weber. She wants to talk to you." Frankie turned to Lauren and waited for her to say something. "Frankie," Lauren's tone, drenched in gentle persuasion, placed additional emphasis on his name. "Is there anyone out there in TV land that you'd like to say hello to?" Frankie nodded. Lauren pointed to the right. "Just look into the camera over there and say whatever you want." Frankie peered at the camera and waved. "Hi, Aunt Candy. I'm on TV." His upper lip twitched slightly to one side, a trait all too familiar for Roxanne. Lauren smiled. "And what a lovely child he is. I'd say there's a striking resemblance." She paused. "Wouldn't you?" She topped off her declaration with a triumphant stare straight into the eye of the camera. The damage was done. Anybody with eyes could see that Lauren wasn't speaking of any resemblance between mother and child. Frankie's locks, curly and black, were far from Roxanne's straight chestnut brown hair. Nothing about his piercing baby blues resembled Roxanne's unusual eyes shaded the color of purple violets. No, it was clear. Frankie didn't resemble his mother at all. After filming the show, Roxanne and Frankie went home to their apartment overlooking Central Park. Candy had left for Florida the day before, at Roxanne's insistence, and now Roxanne was wondering what she'd been thinking. Heading to Florida, a place she hadn't been in 5 years, wasn't Roxanne's idea. If she'd had her way, she would have chosen to never set foot in the state again. But Jerry, her psychiatrist, had said she'd never be free of her demons if she didn't face them. And that meant returning to Florida for an extended stay. Well, at least she could nip this Lauren Weber fiasco in the butt before she left. Sure, Lauren's audience had seen Frankie, but if Roxanne could keep the whole of America from getting a first-hand look at him, she had to try. Inside her bedroom, Roxanne carelessly tossed her clothes inside her suitcase while holding the telephone against her ear with her shoulder. "I do not want it aired." "They won't go for it," Walt said with a measure of regret in his tone. "What they've got is too hot." "Well, threaten them then." She cradled the receiver in her hand while various scenarios, all of them revenge-oriented and involving Frank, wreaked havoc in her mind. "Tell them they'll never get another interview from anyone even remotely associated with Simon Productions. Ever again." "Roxanne." "I tried. They don't care." His words were kind and draped in a sympathetic tone, but they missed the mark. "It's going to air in a couple of weeks." "A couple of weeks?" Nothing could lessen that blow. "Why so soon?" "Rox," Walt said. "They aren't going to let this one sit on the back burner. Just go on to Florida and let the whole thing blow over." Blow up was more like it. "Okay," Roxanne agreed in a defeated tone. She slammed the phone down but continued to stare at it. Lauren Weber had managed to turn her world upside down. Bitch. A few days later, Florida. Roxanne's red Porsche sailed down the highway. With a convertible top down, her hair flew recklessly around her head, and she'd reach up from time to time to push it out of her face. Approaching Tampa, she checked the radio to see if she could pick up Y95. The station had been a favorite of hers. After a few twists of the dial, the hard-rocking sounds of Jay Giles poured out from the speakers. As the band serenaded her with their wit about how much love stinks, she said softly, "Boy, does it ever." 10 minutes later, she passed the Welcome to Tampa sign, stirring a familiar excitement within her. Yesterday, returning to Florida was the last thing she wanted. But now, surprisingly, coming home felt good. Of course, the new house probably had a little something to do with that. She'd never laid eyes on it outside of photographs, but she already loved it. After Jerry had convinced her she needed to go back to Florida for her own sanity, she'd been so scared that Frank was going to magically appear from out of nowhere that she bought the house through a service. She knew the floor plan inside and out, even though she'd never set foot in the place. At the intersection of Bush and Armenia, Roxanne waited for the traffic light to turn green. No matter how good coming home felt, it had little effect on her mounting dread. If Frank saw that show or heard about it, he'd find her no matter where she was. She could only hope this would be the last place he'd look. Roxanne pulled her car into the semicircle driveway and parked behind Candy's black Targa. She climbed out, and neither the humidity nor the heat dissuaded her as she went to the passenger side and gathered her sleeping son in her arms. Heading toward the front door of the 2-story wood-trimmed house, she found it even more appealing than she had when she'd seen it in the photographs. In person, it looked even more inviting, nestled amid tropical trees and plants. At the door, she was unable to get to her keys and leaned on the doorbell. The door opened promptly. "Hi, Jameson." She felt a measure of comfort seeing half the husband and wife team that had been in her employ since right after Frankie's birth.
"Good afternoon, Miss Roxanne."
Jameson's accent suggested that he knew how to do things properly. And as far as Roxanne could see, he did.
"Shall I take him?"
"Yes, please." She passed Frankie off to him. "Have Rose put him to bed," she said of Jameson's wife.
"Miss Candy is out by the pool."
"Thanks." She gave Jameson a smile, then darted through the house and out into the backyard. Candy was bikini-clad and laid out on a poolside lounge chair, soaking up the sun. The tropical heat washed over Roxanne in a thick wave of sweltering moisture as she dropped into a nearby chair. She'd almost forgotten how unpleasant Florida's humidity could be. Candy didn't move. Roxanne considered that she might be sleeping and cleared her throat. Candy's eyes opened behind her sun clouds. After a moment, she asked, "How'd the interview go?" An unpleasant feeling devoured Roxanne. Grudgingly, she admitted, "Not well."
"So what happened?"
All she wanted to talk about was Garrett Hollander. Roxanne tried to show as little emotion as possible, even to Candy. Candy tipped up her sunglasses and propped them on her forehead.
That was the subject?
In the background, one of Garrett Hollander's songs played on the radio sitting on the ground at Candy's side. Since Roxanne's mysterious departure from Frank's life 5 years ago, he'd written many songs about her. Some indicated his hatred for her, while others simply begged her to come back. There were also songs alleging that she'd been a hooker. It was one of those songs that played on Candy's radio now.
"I played the fool. I trusted her. But she let me down. 'Cause while I was away, Roxanne was out selling herself all over town."
I'm surprised she didn't ask me about that damn song. Roxanne hated that song, and she cursed Frank for writing it. To hear him tell it, she'd been out prostituting herself just because she could. It hadn't been that way at all, and it pissed her off that Frank would suggest as much.
"So tell me what happened."
Candy flashed Roxanne an eager smile. She loved gossip, especially when it involved the two of them. "Well, to make a long story short," Roxanne hesitated. "She asked me point blank if Frank Garrett was the father of my son."
"No."
Candy's disbelief glowed in her emerald eyes, brightening them.
"What'd you say?"
"I denied it, of course. But the bitch wouldn't give up." She paused long enough to get a hold of her frustration. "She even conned me into bringing Frankie out on the set."
"During taping?"
Candy's voice shook. "Oh, yes. And she commented on the resemblance, too." Roxanne reacted like an injured puppy. "And she wasn't talking about me and Frankie."
"Oh, wow."
"If he sees that show..." Roxanne's voice trailed off as she thought about Frank. Quickly, though, she regained her composure and added, "I hate to think of the consequences."
"Frank's in his own little world," Candy said. "The last thing he's got time for is to keep up with you."
"Yeah, right." Roxanne's disbelief escaped in her laughter. Candy didn't speak right away. The silence was deafening.
"Did you know their first album was a flop?" she asked, but didn't wait for an answer. "When their second album came out, it did so well that people went out and bought the first one."
"They have 2 albums?" Roxanne asked innocently.
Candy raked an admonishing glare over Roxanne. "They have 3, which is my point exactly."
It was like she knew Roxanne had chosen to play dumb. Uh-oh. That meant the lecturer was coming.
"It hasn't been your concern to keep up with him, so why should he have gone to so much trouble to keep up with you?"
"Okay, so maybe you're right." Roxanne wasn't quite ready to give up the fight. But if what you say is true, then why do you know so much about them? Candy ignored Roxanne. You do have reason to be concerned, though. How so? If Frank sees that show, you're dead meat. She slid her sunglasses back over her eyes and sank down into the lounge chair. That's very comforting, Can. Roxanne's voice trailed off. She didn't want to think about what might happen. Nothing good could come from that. Face the facts, Candy said. Frankie is a walking, talking replica of Frank. Her unwelcome words surrounded Roxanne like a fine mist. I know you had your reasons for running away from him. Compassion filled her tone, yet it offered little comfort. But you better realize, it just might be time to pay the piper. Roxanne went upstairs to take a long, hot bubble bath. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub, she poured bath oil into the stream of running water. She sat there, almost in a trance, watching the tub fill and the bubbles grow. Satisfied with the water level, she turned it off, got undressed, and stepped in. Sliding down through the bubbles, she began to feel confident that the water would soothe her soul and chase her troubles away. Why was this happening now? Especially after all this time. Everything had been going so well, too. But now the bottom was about to fall out. Why did it always come back to Frank Garrett? Roxanne tried to put him out of her mind, just as she'd tried to do so many times before. But somehow he always managed to keep sneaking back into her thoughts. A long time ago, she thought running away would solve her problems. She thought running away would set her free. Free from Frank. Now she realized she'd been mistaken. Her past was about to come back to haunt her. She knew she wasn't up to facing Frank. She didn't know if she'd ever be ready for that. In Roxanne's mind, she had done nothing but love Frank. She'd only tried to help him, and in return, he'd let her down. Once again, he'd doubted her before giving her the chance to explain, and he'd promised he would never do that again. Roxanne wanted desperately to go back to the beginning, back when things were fine, back before the hatred, back when there was only love. As the water rocked back and forth, time also rocked back and forth, until Roxanne had no concept of time at all. And once again, she had no idea what was the past and what was the present. Part 1. Chapter 1. 1981. Late spring. Tennessee. The grave had settled during the 13 months since Chuck's death. A year. Wasn't that the expected mourning period for a grief-stricken widow? If so, her time was up. But Roxanne didn't feel any better. Candy had said it was because Roxanne couldn't let go with all the reminders around her everywhere she went. Tears slid down Roxanne's cheeks as she clawed at the dirt near the headstone and dug a hole, finger deep. Satisfied with the depth, she lifted her gaze back to the marker and laid her hand against the name. Charles Ray Simon. I'm sorry. She choked out the words between sobs. I have to go away. Candy says I have to for my own good. Her hand slid down the marble. And you always said your sister was one smart cookie. She tried to laugh, but it turned into a pitiful outcry of pain. Roxanne slipped the simple gold band off her left ring finger. The hurt rippled up her chest and poured out in her soft weeping. She dropped her wedding band into the hole and pushed the dirt back in, burying the ring. Her heart splintered a little more, and she swore she felt the last solid piece crumble. Roxanne Cantrell Simon was convinced, at the age of 19, that she'd never love again. For 6 months, Candy Simon had been campaigning for a change, a new start somewhere else. She wanted it, and her best friend turned sister-in-law needed it. And it wasn't like Roxanne didn't have the money, thanks to an insurance policy and the wrongful death lawsuit. Finally, Roxanne relented, agreeing to set out for parts unknown. It must have been fate that led Roxanne and Candy to Tampa. No other plausible explanation existed for them ending up there. When they left Tennessee, they had no definite destination in mind. And what made Roxanne take the freeway south rather than some other direction is anybody's guess. A few days later, Roxanne and Candy found themselves in Tampa, Florida at the Ramada Inn off 275's Bush Boulevard exit. They'd stopped to see what Tampa had to offer. It was from the desk clerk at the Ramada Inn that they discovered The Other Place, which turned out to be a trendy, hard-rocking club where Candy felt right at home. The jam-packed party atmosphere overwhelmed Roxanne and electrified her all at the same time. A large bar just inside the door off to the right offered highly sought-after stools for the club's many patrons. Directly to the left, a couple of steps led up to tables in the DJ's booth. A path, straight down the middle and well past the big bar, led to steps descending to the dance floor and the stage off to the left. Almost hidden, especially from the front door, another smaller bar off to the right could easily seat about 20 people. Roxanne found comfort sitting at the club's main bar, but on the end near the door. Candy, however, preferred to spend her time out on the dance floor. Every so often, she'd appear at Roxanne's side long enough to sip her drink, then the music would beckon her back onto the dance floor. Several men had asked Roxanne to dance, but she turned them all down briskly. Getting up there on that dance floor was the last thing she intended to do. Roxanne preferred to sit back and watch the goings-on of the bar's other patrons. She scanned the crowd. About halfway down on the left side of the bar, he caught her eye. His tall, willowy frame towered above the others. His jet-black hair, full of body, cascaded just past his shoulders. Even though she was too far away to identify the color of his eyes, something about them reached across the bar and captivated her. Realizing he'd been watching her stare at him, her bashfulness took over and she looked away. She wondered where Candy was, but that didn't last long. Roxanne's desire to sneak another peek at the handsome man was too strong. This is crazy. What could a man like that possibly see in me? She couldn't help herself and cut her eyes back toward him. But he was gone. Frank hadn't been expecting much when he decided to hit The Other Place on this rare night off when the band wasn't playing. He wasn't really looking. He knew half a dozen girls he could call up right now and they'd drop whatever or whoever they were doing and run down to the bar to meet him. But they just wanted to be seen out on the town with a musician, and he wasn't in the mood to be anyone's trophy tonight. Then he saw her, and she'd been watching him. He'd moved to the other side of the bar on purpose, just to see if she'd look for him. She did, and it pleased him. There was something about her, something distinctively different from any of the other girls he'd ever known. An air of genuine innocence permeated around this girl whose beauty mesmerized him. Her light chestnut hair hung halfway down her back, complementing a smile that had a way of luring him in. She was a classic beauty, but he didn't think she knew it. She'd been passively watching the goings-on around her, but now she was actively searching for someone in particular. Him. A girl, a pretty blonde but not Frank's type, danced her way back to Miss Your Mind Tonight and grabbed her drink. Frank stepped up to the bar and ordered another beer. Candy leaned against the bar and sucked down her drink. When she came up for air, she asked Roxanne, "What's up? Seen anything you like?" At first, Roxanne wanted to tell Candy about him, but her better judgment told her to keep quiet. "No." "Get me another drink, would you?" Candy asked as another dance tune filled the air. She ran off, grabbing some guy's hand on her way to the dance floor. Roxanne was glad she hadn't confided in Candy. Candy would have embarrassed her. She would have gone and gotten the guy and brought him back to Roxanne's side. That could have turned into an humiliating situation, especially if he didn't want to be gotten. "Your friend seems to constantly abandon you." The voice came from behind her. bringing Roxanne out of her thoughts of impending doom. He was standing behind her. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. An unfamiliar excitement spread through her. Unable to resist, she glanced over her shoulder and got lost in his piercing blue eyes. Her instincts told her to look away, but she couldn't. No matter how hard she tried to break the spell, she couldn't do it. "Let me guess." He winked at her. "Your friend likes to dance, but you don't." "No, not really." "I hear you." He took a drink of his beer. "I hate dancing." She giggled shyly and looked away. "I'm Frank," he said. And instantly a strange look crossed her face. He wasn't expecting that. "What's the matter? You don't like my name?" he asked, feigning injury. "No, it's not that." She shook her head. "Frank is my father's name." "Well, there you go." He glanced at the empty bar stool at her side. "Mind if I sit down?" "Be my guest." Her heart fluttered so wildly she thought it might fly out of her chest. "I'm Roxanne." She managed to introduce herself, which wasn't easy since the stranger sitting beside her was totally enamoring. "Roxanne." He repeated her name and paused as if pondering it. "Can I call you Roxy?" He flashed her an irresistible smile and it was all over. "Suit yourself," she said. "So long as I can call you Frankie." He laughed. "Deal." She could call him whatever she wanted, if it got him further entwined in her good graces. "How old are you?" he asked, more for chit-chat's sake than anything else. 19? "Where are you from?" Millions of questions filled his head. He wanted to learn everything there was to know about her. "Tennessee." "How long you been living here?" She shook her head. "We don't live here." She played with her straw and regret stabbed at his heart. She must have sensed it because she quickly offered, "But if my sister and I decide we like it here, we just might stay." That thought mended his wound. If there was the slightest chance she'd hang around for a while, he'd convince her it was the thing to do. "Is there anything I can do to persuade you to stay?" he said, pouring on the charm. "What are you, writing a book?" Her sharp tone snapped the words at him. The smirk accompanying her jab lasted for all of a second or two before it melted from her face. "I'm sorry. That was rude." "Don't be sorry," he said. "You've got spunk. I like that." She gave him one of those looks that said, "No, I don't." Did that mean Frank was affecting her in a way that no one ever had? He hoped so. He bought her a drink, another first for Frank, and they talked the night away. Normally, he would have used his status as the lead singer and co-founder of one of the area's most admired bar bands to his advantage, but this time he didn't think it would get him far. Instead of trying to charm her with the promise of music, he conceded the stage. Besides, getting to know her was a lot more interesting than bragging about himself. Before Frank knew it, last call had come on like a whirlwind. Listen, he didn't want to miss the opportunity to see her again. "If I give you my phone number, would you promise to call me? Even if it's only to say goodbye?" "Sure." Frank wrote his number on a napkin and Roxanne stuck it inside her purse without looking at it. "Can I see you and your sister to your car?" He offered because it seemed like the gentlemanly thing to do. "No, but you can walk us to my van," she chuckled, as if she'd realized the humor in her remark. Cute. Frank had no choice but to laugh. "I owe you," he promised. Candy couldn't imagine seeing Roxanne in such a frisky mood. This wasn't her nature at all, but Roxanne was laughing. She couldn't remember the last time she'd heard Roxanne laugh. At that moment, Candy decided she liked Frank Garrett. The three of them walked through the parking lot and Frank decided to see if he could get Candy on his side. "Candy, I was telling Roxy that if you girls decide to stick around for a while, Maybe you can come see my band play sometime. That'd be fun, Candy said without much interest, then got in the van. Frank turned to Roxanne. Well, he slid his hands inside his pockets and smiled. I guess I'd better let you go. Was he nuts? It must be so. Why was he not trying to close the deal tonight? His instincts were telling him to wait. It was a move he hoped he didn't end up regretting. It was nice meeting you, Roxanne said. May I kiss your cheek? I'd like that. Frank's lips brushed against her face, swathing her in chills fueled by a craving she'd never experienced. Not to this extent. She shuddered, unsure about what to do with the unfamiliar desires. Good night. He looked like he was pushing himself to leave. Finally, when he did turn to walk away, Roxanne felt like a part of her was leaving with him. Night. Her voice trailed off as she watched him go. Granted, Chuck was the only man who'd ever kissed her before tonight, but she couldn't remember a single one of his kisses ever leaving her feeling so indefensible. Hey, Rocky, Candy called to her. He's gone. You can get in the van now. Roxanne hesitated, trying to bury the emotion she was sure had found its way to her face. She couldn't let Candy, Chuck's sister, see what she was feeling. She climbed into the van on the passenger's side and avoided looking at Candy. What's wrong? Candy asked. Nothing. Roxanne went for casual, but feared she'd missed. I thought you liked him. I do. Finally, she looked at Candy. But maybe I should just forget the whole thing. Why? Candy gave her a scrutinizing glance. You like him. He definitely likes you, so what's the problem? Well... Roxanne knew it was a bad idea, but she said it anyway. I guess I feel guilty. Guilty? Candy said, confused. For what? For feeling the way I do. Candy's eyes lit up like a light bulb had turned on inside her head. You've got the hots for Frank. She pointed an accusatory finger at Roxanne. Is that bad? No. Candy shook her head. Listen, you shouldn't feel guilty because you want Frank. Chuck wouldn't want you to feel guilty. My brother would want you to do whatever it takes to make yourself happy. Roxanne knew Candy was right about that. Chuck wouldn't want either of them to stop living just because he had. She felt a rush of confidence as Candy gave her a quick nod. Then Roxanne remembered what she'd said about Frank liking her. Do you really think he likes me? She asked. Or do you think he just wants a piece? Well, he probably wants a piece, Candy said. But I don't think that's all he wants. Why me? Look, don't sell yourself short. Candy started the van and shifted into gear. I believe that Frank genuinely likes you. And everybody knew. Candy was a good judge of character. Sunning by the motel's pool, Candy looked down at herself. In a matter of days, she'd acquired a nice tan. There was something to be said for Florida. Another month and she'd be a gorgeous bronze color, something that Kathy Pritchard back home would kill for. She looked at Roxanne, wondering if she'd been thinking about Frank at all. Candy sure had. She hadn't forgotten how he'd made Roxanne laugh. He needed to do that again, but Roxanne had to call him before that could happen. Apparently, Candy was going to have to light that fire. Rocky. She put forth extra effort to sound casual. Do you like it here? Sure, Roxanne said a bit indifferently. Well, let's stay here then. Roxanne's head popped up. She shaded her eyes and looked at Candy. You really want to? Sure. Candy didn't want to leave Tampa without Roxanne exploring the possibility of what might happen with Frank. If he could help her mend her heart, even a little bit, then it would be worth it. And you could call your friend Frank. Maybe he's got a really cute friend in that band of his who's looking for a gorgeous petite blonde. Candy's contagious laughter filled the air, infecting Roxanne. Yep. Candy was pretty much convinced. Frank Garrett was just the medicine Roxanne needed. Chapter 2. Roxanne and Candy scoured Tampa in search of somewhere to live. They found the perfect place in Temple Terrace. The price took about half of Roxanne's money, but it was a sound investment. They decorated the 2-story condo in a tropical atmosphere, accentuating it with lots of plants and the colors of sandy beaches, sunrises, sunsets, and the ocean. In the spacious open floor plan, the living room sank cozily down and flowed into a screened-in terrace. Off to the right, the dining room and kitchen blended in with the sweeping atmosphere. Candy's bedroom suite was down a hallway just behind the kitchen. A bathroom and another small bedroom were on the opposite side of the hall. To the right of the front door, stairs disappeared up toward Roxanne's domain. Halfway up, she'd placed a love seat in a small landing, and from there it took a few more strides to get to her master suite. Large, towering windows spanned the far wall and filtered sunshine over the king-size bed. On the opposite side of the room, a closet and a dressing area led into the condominium's best feature, a Romanesque-style bathroom complete with an oversized jacuzzi tub. It took the girls a couple of weeks to settle in. Then Candy proceeded to badger Roxanne until she agreed to call Frank. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Roxanne fiddled with the napkin Frank had written his number on at the bar, and tried to convince herself to pick up the phone. What if he'd lost interest? Or worse yet, what if he didn't remember her? She considered the odds of whether or not Candy would believe that. In the end, Roxanne decided Candy wouldn't be satisfied until she had thoroughly humiliated herself. Roxanne gathered the courage to dial the number on the napkin. The butterflies began to stir. "Hello." A deep voice answered the phone, but Roxanne knew it wasn't Frank. "Hi." She swallowed hard as the butterflies began to flutter about. "Is Frank there?" "Sure," he said. "Can I say who's calling?" "Yes." Roxanne remembered how Frank had wanted to call her Roxy. "It's Roxy." "You're real?" His disbelief reached across the wire. "I was beginning to think he was losing it. But you're real." "Well, of course I'm real." "Hold on." Silence crowded the next few seconds, and it dragged on for what seemed an eternity, until she heard Frank say, "Roxy?" His voice calmed the butterflies. "I hope I'm not calling it a bad time," she said. "No, not at all." He quickly offered reassurance. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to call me, though." "Sorry about that," she said. "But we've been really busy." "Getting a place to live, I hope?" "As a matter of fact, we did." "That's good news." Relief poured out in his tone. "I was hoping you weren't calling to say goodbye," he said with a bit of nervous laughter. "Think you and Candy might want to come see my band play this evening?" "I'd like that," she said, elated that he still wanted to see her. At 7:15, the doorbell rang. Candy had hot rollers in her hair, and she was in the midst of putting on her makeup. Damn, she should probably get it since it was doubtful that Roxanne was ready. Candy couldn't care less if Frank saw her like this. "I got it," she yelled, heading for the door. Candy expected to see Frank standing outside the door. She also expected him to be alone, but he wasn't. She slammed the door. "Candy?" Frank's voice filtered in as he pounded on the door. "Open up!" She leaned against the door. "Frank, count to 10, then you can come inside." Candy made a mad dash for her bedroom. Frank opened the door carefully and peered in. "Candy?" Nothing. It was quiet and still. He pushed the door open and cautiously stepped inside. "Come on, Rich," he said to his friend. Frank stopped just inside the doorway. Rich paused at his side. Got yourself a rich girl, huh, Frank? She's not rich. Frank shook his head. He had no facts to go on, it was just a feeling. This place belongs to a rich person, Rich said, looking around. Frank glanced at Rich and frowned. Intuitively, he knew he'd find Roxanne upstairs. Wait here, he said to Rich and took the steps 2 at a time. Halfway up, he saw the love seat and sat down. For some reason, and why, he couldn't explain. Giving Roxanne the chance to come out seemed like a really good idea. Frank, a gentleman? Who knew? What the hell? Rich decided he'd go find the mystery girl. She hadn't exactly been thrilled to see him standing behind Frank. But Rich was never one to back down from a challenge. And she was just his type. A pretty blonde with nice legs and a great rack. He headed into the hallway off the kitchen and opened the door on the right. An empty room. Rich glanced farther down the passage and saw 2 more doors, one on each side. The one on the left was closer and slightly ajar, so he opted to try it. He tapped on the door but got no response. So being an adventurous guy, he opened it enough to stick his head inside. Hey, lady, he called out playfully. Another door slammed shut. With a surplus of confidence, Rich went to the closed door inside the bedroom. Hey, lady, he called out lightheartedly. The door obviously led to the bathroom, and therefore she'd cornered herself. You got any more doors in there to slam in my face? He laughed softly, amusing himself if no one else. Who are you? Her sharp tone traveled through the door. Rich? He tried not to laugh, but it was hard. What are you doing here? She asked, still through the door. Hey, look, he said. Can't you at least come out here and give me the 3rd degree face to face? He turned away from the door and rolled his gaze around the room. Am I that ugly? The door swung open and her finger flew up in his face. You know, she said in a scolding tone, you got a lot of nerve. Candy stopped mid-sentence. Every word had abandoned her. He wasn't ugly at all. A wild mane of golden ringlets hung down just past his shoulders and filled her mind with thoughts of tangling it in her hands in the heat of the moment. Sable eyes, dangerously alluring, appeared to emit sparks of fire and electricity, snagging what little sensibility she had left. Candy was impressed. Frank fidgeted, still sitting on the love seat halfway up the stairs. His anticipation was about to get the better of him. He'd waited long enough to see her. Roxy. Instantly, she appeared at the top of the stairs. When their eyes met, she smiled. He stood. Hi. I'm almost ready, she said. Come on up. Frank sprinted up the stairs and stopped inside the doorway, looking around. This is a really nice place you got here. He sat in the chair next to the door. I wasn't aware they rented them out, he added offhandedly. Fishing for information hadn't been his intention. They don't. She disappeared through a door on the far side of the room. Frank got up and followed her. Even though the evidence was mounting suggesting otherwise, she didn't seem like the type that had been bred with money. He'd known some trust fund debs in his day, but she didn't have that superior air about her. No, there was only one way a girl like Roxanne could come by a place like this. He didn't want to believe that either. This may be none of my business, he said. But how did you come by this place? She saw the confusion on his face, although she didn't understand it. I inherited some money from a death in the family? Roxanne told the truth in a roundabout way. She looked around the room. This place took almost all of it, she said with a shrug and a smile. I'm sorry about the death. Thanks. She looked away and went back to adding the finishing touches to her makeup and hair. Maybe she should have told him about Chuck right then and there. But she didn't want to think about Chuck anymore. The only thing she wanted to concern herself with now was Frank Garrett. Chapter 3. That evening, Frank's band was scheduled to play at a club called Mark Twain. He, Roxanne, Rich, and Candy arrived at the already crowded bar a little past 9. The locals loved Garrett Hollander, and when they played anywhere in Tampa Bay, their fans packed the clubs. Frank took Roxanne's hand and led her proudly through the mass of people. Many women in the crowd stared with stunned looks. Their reactions didn't surprise or bother him. He'd never walked into a club with a girl on his arm. Now walking out with a girl, that was a different story. But bringing a chick with him had never been a consideration. That was too much like a date. Not to mention that it would tie him to her for the entire evening. The band's groupies quickly did away with any bewilderment they'd felt as their frustration turned, almost instantly, into nasty looks that were directed first at Roxanne and then Candy. As they passed by the waiting crowd, Roxanne was too naive to realize what was going on and failed to see the imaginary daggers shooting out from the eyes of Frank's spurned and would-be lovers. Candy, on the other hand, knew exactly what was happening. She held tight to Rich's hand as they made their way through the crowd. Candy knew she and Roxanne were the envy of every woman there, simply because they were with the band. Inside the dressing room, Roxanne and Candy met 3 of the other 4 guys in the band: Bobby, Ronnie, and Mike. It didn't take long for the 4th and final member, Glenn, to walk through the door with a very pretty girl on his arm. Her long red hair seemed to brighten her green eyes that sparkled with the color of jade. Roxanne and Candy soon learned she was Glenn's wife, Glenna. "Hi." Glenna flashed a friendly smile at the girls and then turned to Frank. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll take good care of them while you're on stage." "You better," he said. Glenna turned to her husband. "You've got work to do." She gave him a quick kiss. "I'll just go ahead and take Roxy and Candy out to the bar. We'll get ourselves a drink." "Glenna," Rich said, "don't go telling them any wild stories about us, okay?" "Rich," Glenna laughed. "Trust me." Glenna was elated to have someone to sit with besides the groupies who'd gather around her once they found out she was with the band. But she knew this was different. Frank had already given the band fair warning to be on their best behavior. He didn't want anybody doing or saying anything to upset Roxanne. Frank turned to Roxanne, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Go on out there with Glenna." He gave her a wink and a smile that turned up one side of his lip. His hand slid down her arms and his fingers tangled around hers. "I'll see you during the break." "Okay," Roxanne said, totally under his spell. His lips brushed against her cheek. Chills whipped through her unexpectedly, leaving her dripping with desire. "Now you fellas play pretty for us," Glenna said as she, Roxanne, and Candy left the dressing room. Moments later, the band descended the stage. Everybody except Frank and Rich. Curiosity swept over Roxanne, and she let her eyes search the hallway leading back to the dressing room. It was empty, at least of the one person she was looking for. Frank. She paid little attention to the other band members as they filtered out among the drums, microphones, and keyboards. The crowd cheered. A few loud chords thundered through the club, and Glenn pounded out a drum roll. The locals celebrated louder as if they knew Frank and Rich would be out soon. When it did happen, when Frank and Rich finally emerged in 2 separate spotlights, the crowd went wild. Frank straightened his guitar strap and then stepped up to the microphone. Rich teased the fans with a little riff of something that sounded a lot like Jay Giles. Admiration engulfed Roxanne as she zeroed in on Frank. He adjusted his microphone and rested his hands on his guitar. A strange silence fell over the crowd. She heard Glenn's drumsticks clicking as if chanting 1, 2, 3, and then, in perfect harmony, the band dove full throttle into some April wine. Frank started singing, and Roxanne knew for sure that her heart had abandoned her. Hours later, after Frank announced last call, Glenna hopped off her bar stool and looked at Roxanne and Candy. "Come on, let's go back to the dressing room." Roxanne and Candy glanced at each other, then followed Glenna back to the empty dressing room. Glenna took a seat and they did the same. She dug around in her purse and came out with a joint and fired it up. After taking a couple of hits, she passed it to Candy. Candy took it, toked on it, and passed it to Roxanne. Roxanne wasn't sure what to do. She hadn't smoked any weed since they'd left Tennessee. Oh well. She gave in to temptation and took the joint from Candy. Besides, what could it hurt? After a few hits, Glenna left the joint to her newfound friends and concentrated on a tote bag sitting in a corner near the door. She took out a handful of towels, a blow dryer, and a brush. She put the towels on the counter near the door, plugged the hairdryer into a nearby outlet, and waited with it in one hand and the brush in the other. What the hell was she doing? Roxanne looked at Candy, and then at the towels sitting by the door. She had no idea what they were for, or what Glenna was seemingly waiting for, and she doubted Candy did either. Her questions were answered when the band filed into the dressing room. Each one grabbed a towel and used it to soak up the moisture from their sweat-drenched hair and faces. Glenn dropped into the seat in front of Glenna, and she began drying his hair. Frank ignored everyone in the room except Roxanne. That included several groupies who'd been vying desperately all evening for his attention. Instead of making them perform for his affection, as he would have done on any other night before this one, he pulled a chair up in front of Roxanne, turned it around backward, and sat down facing her. He took the towel to his damp hair, swabbing out some of the moisture. His thoughts settled around her beauty. Her eyes sparkled with the color of purple African violets. Frank had never seen anything like it. He leaned forward and bent sideways to look at her eyes from the side. "What?" she asked curiously. "Are you wearing contacts?" It had to be an enhancement. How could anybody's eyes be that color naturally? He'd seen a lot of girls in his day, and he'd never seen eyes like these. "No," she shook her head. "Hey, Frank." Rich's voice infiltrated his thoughts. "Earth to Frank." "What?" Frank said abruptly, his eyes never leaving Roxanne's face. "Candy wants to get something to eat. You and Roxy want to come too?" Rich's words came across as a real invitation, but Frank knew better. Rich wanted nothing more than to get Candy alone. "How about it, Roxy?" Frank reached for her hands and entwined his fingers around hers. "You hungry?" he asked, even though it'd irritate Rich. But maybe she wanted something to eat. Rich was thankful Roxanne had declined to join him and Candy for breakfast. They ran by the apartment and grabbed Rich's car. Normally, he would have coaxed the girl up to his bedroom and forgot about feeding her, but there was something about Candy. Her long hair was gold like the morning sun. Her eyes were as green as emeralds. Pretty in a bright, cheery sort of way. She seemed to radiate electricity. She said exactly what was on her mind. And she'd ordered a smorgasbord of food that was now laid out in front of her. She had no qualms about eating it either. Rich found petite little Candy and her frankness utterly fascinating. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Tennessee," she said. "And where are you from?" "Right here." "Born at Denny's, huh?" "Although it'd be a great honor," he played along. "I cannot boast that privilege, honestly." The urge to laugh was too strong, even though he was the butt of the joke. "You can take a joke," she said. "I like that." "How old are you?" He dove back into his desire to know her better. 19, she said. "And how old are you?" 25. "Geez, you're old," she said with such a straight face that it almost hid her inner laughter. "Who's older, anyway?" "You are," she giggled. "No." He was unable to contain the urge to laugh that had been lingering around for some time. "I mean you and Roxy." "Oh." She tilted her head back slightly. "Roxanne is." She dropped it at that, but he got the feeling there was more on her mind. Maybe she was worried about her friend. Frank did have quite the reputation as a ladies' man. At least Rich could ease her mind in that department. "You know," he took on a serious tone, "my friend is quite taken with your sister." Look, she said, you don't have to sell me on Frank Garrett. What Rocky does is strictly her business. I'm serious. She's all he's talked about ever since the night they met. Rich thought the whole thing was a bit corny. Would you do me one favor? She took on a look of genuine sincerity. Rocky, she's very naive and vulnerable, she said as if it were a secret. Would you explain that to Frank? I don't understand, Rich said, baffled. Candy hesitated and seemed to be searching for the right words. Finally, she shook her head and looked at Rich. She doesn't understand about guys just wanting to get laid. Not that I know all the details or anything, Rich said carefully. But I don't think sex is Frank's main objective. Frank stood behind Roxanne while she unlocked the front door. I had a nice time tonight, she said, entering the condo. So did I. He followed her inside. But I'd like to take you on a real date when I have a night off. He'd used that line before, but this time he really meant it. I'd like that. She stepped down into the living room and claimed a seat on the end of the couch. But I did enjoy watching you guys play tonight. You're pretty good. Yeah. Frank's sharp laughter peeled out before he could stop it. As far as playing other people's music goes, he added, criticizing himself for his inability to write a song. Well, I have a feeling you'll do okay. She had such certainty in her voice that he could almost believe it. Someday I'll probably be standing in a long line, she supposed, trying to get tickets to your show. That's where you're wrong, he said decisively. You will be right there by my side. Garrett Hollander was among the best, as far as bar bands go. Rich could play the guitar like nobody's business. The problem was that no one could come up with any original lyrics. And everybody knew that without original music, GH wouldn't get anywhere in the rock and roll world. Frank wouldn't let himself forget that. Music was his life. He knew he'd never be any good at anything else. And now Roxanne had come into the picture. She wasn't like the others. Her mere presence made him feel like he could do anything. He felt a certain sense of pride looking out over the audience and seeing her sitting there watching him play. Somehow, he knew she was the one thing in this world that could motivate him. He wasn't sure how, but he knew. Somehow, some way, and someday, she would be the root of his success. During the next few weeks, Frank and Rich spent every spare moment they had with Roxanne and Candy. Right away, Frank began his transformation of Roxanne. He changed the way she dressed, draping her in elegance and a subtle hint of sexiness. He taught her to show off her beautiful head of hair and to carry herself with confidence. His efforts paid off. Roxanne had turned into an extraordinary beauty, one worthy to be on the arm of Frank Garrett, the rock star. Chapter 4. Glenn and Glenna owned a place out in the country that was excellent for parties and rehearsals since there were no neighbors around for miles. Every summer they threw a 4th of July bash. And this year they'd invited Roxanne and Candy to their unfettered celebration that always included the rest of the band. The drive out to Thanodisasa had been quiet for Roxanne and Candy. The silence spoke volumes. But Roxanne wasn't going to encourage Candy because it seemed that all she wanted to talk about these days was Frank Garrett and what he did and didn't know. Candy cleared her throat. Uh-oh, here it comes. Roxanne fiddled with the stereo buttons, turning up the volume. Unfortunately, the radio didn't drown out Candy's question. Have you told Frank about Chuck? No. Don't you think you should? No. I think he'll understand. Candy sounded sure of herself. Besides, you've got to tell him sooner or later. Later was better than sooner, as far as Roxanne could see. She'd barely accepted the fact that she'd fallen head over heels for Frank the first time she laid eyes on him. She needed time to let it sink in, then figure out what she was going to do about it. Her biggest fear now was the thought of losing Frank. Maybe that's why she didn't want to tell him about Chuck. The best defense with Candy was diversion. Roxanne decided to turn Candy's examination around on her. What about Rich? Hey, Rocky, Candy objected quickly. How about you handle the settled down scene, she said, and I'll cover swinging singles. At Glenn and Glenna's house, Frank had been hanging around out front, waiting for Roxanne to arrive, and it seemed like it was taking forever. The thought had crossed his mind more than once that maybe he should have gone and gotten her himself. When he'd just about convinced himself to get in his car and go find her, he saw the dust clouds billowing up the lengthy gravel driveway. Finally, the green van appeared amid the haze. Roxanne parked behind Frank's car and got out of the van. He greeted her with a passionate kiss. She returned it hungrily. He hadn't tried to sleep with her, fearful of chasing her off, but he was convinced she wanted to give herself to him. He just couldn't figure out what was stopping her. Was she really waiting for him to make the first move? He'd been going back and forth on that idea for a while. Later on, she said, lacing her fingers with his. Will you come back to my place with me? She looked at him, and for a second, he thought he saw a hint of fear shade her eyes darker. There's something I need to talk to you about. Something wrong? He wasn't happy about the nerves cracking his voice, but what could he do? No. She shook her head and gave him an everything's okay sort of smile. There's nothing wrong. Rich came out of the house and headed straight for Candy. He pressed his lips against hers, and she fought with the feelings overcoming her from his sweet, tender touch. She knew Rich thought he was falling for her. And even though her body argued, she had to discourage it. Let's go for a walk. He tugged at her hand. All right, she agreed reluctantly. He led her away, holding on to her hand a little too tightly, like he was hanging on for dear life. You know you're very special to me, he said, his words wrapped in apprehension. So are you. She hoped he understood there were stipulations. What I'm trying to say is... He stopped talking long enough to clear his throat. You know I really like being with you. The feelings are mutual. She knew what was coming next, and she had to stop it. So don't blow it by saying something you can't follow through on. I thought we were on the same page. So did I, she said, even though she knew they weren't. Why do you think it's so terrible for me to want to tell you that I love you? The pain that notion could bring spoke out in his tone. Rich's anger overcame any fear of rejection that he might have been experiencing. Listen. Somehow she managed to remain calm. I know you think you love me, but someday you'll be out on the road and you'll find out differently. Candy's good senses wouldn't let her venture onto that particular page. Not with Rich, or any other musician for that matter. If that's what Roxanne wanted to do, then more power to her. But it wasn't what Candy was going to do. She wanted no part of it. She wasn't about to get all wrapped up in Rich, just to find out she hadn't been anything more than a passing fancy. She was certain he'd realize, sooner or later, that she wasn't all he wanted or needed. But she didn't want to lose his friendship over this. If you insist on telling me that you love me, that's fine, she said with a one-sided shrug and a bit of a headshake. But our relationship remains as is. No strings. Around 4 o'clock, Frank and Roxanne left to go back to her place. with a promise that they'd meet everyone out by the bay around 8 o'clock for the fireworks show. Once at her place, they lounged on the love seat tucked midway up the stairs. Something was weighing on Frank's mind, and Roxanne wanted to know what it was. "What's wrong?" she asked, winding a lock of his wavy hair around her finger. "I've tried so hard to come up with some lyrics." He searched her face as if it would bring him comfort. "Hell, I've tried to write you a song. But I can't come up with any words to express how I feel about you." His tone was dark and denouncing. "The only thing I can ever come up with is, I love you." She wasn't expecting that. "Really?" "Yes. I love you, girl." Roxanne draped her arms around Frank. "Want to know something?" She teased him with sweet, sensuous kisses. "There's only one thing I want to know right now." "I love you too." A wave of relief rushed over Frank. She loved him. That was all that mattered. Nothing could stop him now, except maybe his inability to write a simple little song. "But wait," she pulled away. "We've got to talk. There's something I have to tell you." The seriousness of her tone evoked the return of Frank's fear. "What's up?" he asked, but wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She hesitated for the longest time. He could almost see the wheels turning inside her head. It doused him with an uneasy feeling. "Candy isn't my sister." "That's it?" His fear vanished. "That's not such a big deal." "She's my sister-in-law." Now Candy's actions toward Rich were starting to make sense. "She's married to your brother?" "I don't have a brother." If Roxanne didn't have a brother, that could only mean one thing. Frank's fear reappeared. "You're married," he said conclusively. "Jesus, Roxanne, you just told me you love me." "And I do." "But you're married." He glared at her, hoping she felt some of the contempt that had overwhelmed him. "You sure pulled one over on me." "Wait just a minute." She backed away from him. Fire lit her eyes as she started shaking her head. "Don't you go passing judgment on me." Well, here it comes. Frank knew this game all too well. Now she's going to try to come up with excuses. But he didn't care about her excuses. Nothing she could say would excuse this. "If you're going to condemn me, the least you can do is hear me out." Frank ignored her plea. He didn't want to hear it, but he couldn't walk away either. The only thing he could do was sit there. The thought, maybe I could get her to leave him, crossed his mind briefly. "Chuck was Candy's brother," she said. "I grew up knowing both of them my whole life. Next to Candy, Chuck was the best friend I've ever had." Frank didn't say anything, and he didn't look at her. "When he asked me to marry him, it just seemed like the natural thing to do." Roxanne began to wonder if the natural thing to do had been the right thing to do. "So we got married a few months before I graduated from high school." It didn't matter if it had been the right choice or not. That song had played. And yet, Roxanne couldn't help wondering if Chuck had felt like he'd been dancing alone. "Where is this guy now?" Frank jumped back into the conversation. He's dead." Those words were still hard to say out loud. She stopped long enough to collect her emotions. "We were married only a few months." Tears dampened her eyes and blurred her vision. "When he died on a motorcycle." Finally, her tears fell. Frank's fear disappeared. Suddenly, he felt sorry for both Roxanne and Candy. He pulled her to him, hoping his embrace would bring her comfort. "Hey," he said softly, brushing her tears aside. "I'm very sorry." "I'm sorry you had to lose someone that meant so much to you."
He wished he could find the words to help her. But I'm also sorry that I doubted you before you had a chance to explain. I'll never do that again. Don't you see, Frankie? She choked back the tears as she looked at him. Now that I've met you, I finally know what it's like to feel that excitement that comes with love. She hung her head. How could she admit that what she thought she'd felt for Chuck wasn't actually what she'd felt at all? Sure, she'd loved him, but she wasn't in love with him. But I never wanted him to die. I wish I could make your pain go away, he said. It's not your fault. I know. But I can't help but wonder if he feels betrayed by all this. Her words flowed out with a little shrug. Surely he must know that I feel things for you I couldn't have ever felt with him. Roxanne. Frank wanted to help her, but he wasn't sure if he had the capability. He'd have to do some persuasive talking, and quickly, too, before Roxanne talked her way out of them because she felt guilty. Don't you think that wherever he is, above all else, he'd want you to be happy? He asked. Even if it means you've found the kind of love with me that you could never have shared with him. Okay, so maybe Frank had a point. Chuck would never be so selfish that he'd begrudge Roxanne happiness. It was like she saw a light at the end of the tunnel. The time had come to put Chuck to rest, once and for all. As the tunnel's light grew brighter, Roxanne was consumed by an even bigger doubt. Now that she and Frank had declared their love for one another, it was only a matter of time before they ended up in bed. And it wasn't that she didn't want to. She was worried that her sexual inexperience would turn out to be a problem. Chuck was the only man she'd ever been with. How could her one-man sexual experience put her in the same league with the girls Frank was used to betting? Simple. It couldn't. And once Frank realized she didn't have a clue, he'd look for someone who did. Before Frank found out about Chuck, he suspected that Roxanne might be a virgin. He'd liked that idea all too well. But in light of her revelation, that was no longer possible. He got that she loved them both, yet in very different ways. But Frank possessed something from Roxanne that her late husband never had and never would have. Desire. It occurred to Frank that her need to be with him was a new experience for her. He hadn't lost sight of the fact that Chuck could be, and probably was, the only man she'd ever been with. Frank decided he could handle that. After all, he'd be the only man alive who'd ever have her. But more than that, Frank would be the only man to possess her mind, heart, body, and soul. As far as Frank could see, things were going to be fine. Just as soon as he had the opportunity to satisfy her hunger, Chuck Simon would become a distant memory, one that seemed more like a movie she'd seen somewhere rather than reality. Chapter 5. Frank had to be certain Roxanne could handle his hunger. You're sure you're ready for this? He had to be sure. Otherwise, his desire could scare her away. Yes, she said, holding on to his hand tightly. You have no idea how much I want this. An impish smile curled on the corners of her mouth. She was thinking about having sex with him. It was sexy as hell, and it turned Frank on. But you've got to understand. A fearful quality echoed in her tone. I'm not like the other girls you've been with. I'm not experienced like them. Roxy. His hand slipped up her arm, drawing her closer to him. I don't want you to be like them. I just want you to be you. His free hand explored the line of her jaw. This is a journey. He kissed her with his eyes. That only you and I can take together. Then let's go, she urged softly. Frank's confidence flourished. Here she was, ready, willing, and able, and very eager to learn anything he wanted to teach her. And what he intended to teach her was that nothing or no one could ever fill the space inside of her that he planned to claim as his own. I have an idea. He pushed himself up from the couch. I'll be back in about an hour. He bent down and gave her a tender kiss before starting down the stairs. Wait! Roxanne ran after him. What's wrong? He stopped midway down the stairs and looked back at her. Baby, there's nothing wrong, he said surely. I've got a really great idea, that's all. He gave her a smile instead of further explanation. You just go on up there and run us a bath in that swimming pool you call a bathtub, he said. And I'll be back before you know it. Without any hint of where he was going or why, he disappeared down the stairs. Roxanne sat down on the stairs, feeling the screams of frustration clawing at the back of her throat. The warmth from his kiss still lingered on her lips. Thoughts crowded her mind, visions of Frank's mouth leaving tantalizingly slow trails over her body. Chills born from desire rolled over her, and the reality of sitting on the stairs, alone, came back to her. She looked around, trying to compose herself. The bathwater. That's what she was supposed to be doing. She went back upstairs and into the bathroom where she filled the tub with bubbled water. In search of the perfect romantic atmosphere, she lit the candles sitting on the back of the bathtub, just in case that'd further her cause. Almost instantly, the sweet scent of roses filled the air. She sat down on the edge of the tub and watched the bubbles grow while visions of Frank kissing her flashed in her mind. In her mind's eye, his lips explored areas other than her mouth, but she lost the images as quickly as she'd first seen them. She struggled to get them back, but was unsuccessful. With the tub nearly full, she turned the water off and went into the bedroom and sat down on the end of the bed. Knowing Frank would be with her soon, hunger trembled throughout her body. Roxanne had better control herself when he did return. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. The thought of his arrival stoked a gently growing fire. She greeted him at the doorway. He stopped long enough to kiss her, and then he carried the things he'd brought back with him on into the bathroom. She followed him and stood by while he took a bottle of chilled champagne, a bag of ice, a bucket, and 2 glasses out of the bags. He put the bucket on the edge of the bathtub, filled it with ice, and submerged the champagne into the glacial chips. After he'd set the glasses beside the bucket, he turned to Roxanne. I'll go out for a second, he said and turned away. Once he reached the door, he glanced over his shoulder. So you can get undressed and get in. Okay. She watched him go, thankful that she didn't have to drop her robe in front of him. Nervous with excitement and uncertainty, she stepped into the bath. She sank down into the water, and a calming sensation washed over her. She wondered briefly if she should call out to Frank and let him know she was ready. The door opened a crack. Roxy? Frank's voice trailed off. Come on in, she said. The water's great. Frank appeared to have nothing on other than a towel wrapped around his waist. He stepped into the tub, opened the towel, and held it out in front of him. As he slid down into the water, he tossed the towel to the floor. Laughing pleasurably, he leaned in and brushed his lips against her cheek and trailed over her skin until he found her mouth. His kiss sent the pit of her stomach into a wild swirl, and then, unexpectedly, he pulled away and reached for the champagne. It's not Dom Perignon, he said, filling the glasses. But I promise you, someday, we'll do this again with the real thing. The brand of champagne doesn't matter. Roxanne accepted a flute and sipped on the cheap bubbly. All I care about is that we're together. By the time she finished her second glass, she was feeling the champagne's effects. This stuff is going straight to my head. She giggled and tried to shake it off. That's the thing about champagne. He took her glass and set the drinks on the edge of the tub and then pulled her closer. It tends to make you lose all your inhibitions. As if his words had released her, she flung herself against him. Her soft curves molded into the contours of his lean body. They explored each other's souls intensely as they made love, and Roxanne experienced fulfillment like she'd never known. "It's okay," Frank said breathlessly. "I'm more in love with you than ever," he added, holding on to her snugly. "I am so in love with you." Suddenly the door sprang open. "Rocky," Candy called out. "Are you in here?" she asked, never giving it a second thought as she walked on in. The last thing she expected to see was Roxanne sitting on top of Frank in the bathtub. She'd always thought nothing could embarrass her. She was wrong. Her mouth dropped open. Roxanne looked up at Candy, showing no shame. She didn't say anything. Candy's hands flew to her mouth. Who would have thought she'd find Roxanne and Frank in the bathtub? Together. She giggled softly and waved at them. "Hi," she smiled, unable to control the urge to laugh. I'm just going to let myself out." She turned back toward the door. "Sorry," she added contritely and slipped out into the hallway. "Stupid, stupid, stupid," she scolded herself, closing the door quietly. "You know," Frank whispered and locked Roxanne within his embrace, "your sister has terrible timing." He laughed softly. From here on out, he vowed to always refer to them as sisters because he had no intention of ever acknowledging Chuck Simon the least bit. Frank sat down on the edge of the bed, taking in every inch of the thin nightshirt sliding down over her body. She went to the nightstand, picked up the remote, switched on the TV, and then handed the device to him. "I'm going to get something to drink," she said. "Can I get you anything? Are you hungry?" "I don't want you to go to any trouble on my account." "You want a sandwich or something?" "Whatever you have, if it's not too much trouble." Roxanne hurried downstairs and into the kitchen. First, she fixed herself a glass of soda, and then she took some ham, cheese, mayonnaise, and mustard out of the fridge. As she took the bread out of the pantry, Candy walked in wearing Rich's shirt. That didn't surprise Roxanne. She knew Candy and Rich had been sleeping together almost from the beginning. "I am so sorry," Candy said. "I didn't, No," Roxanne continued making Frank's sandwich. "But if you'd opened that door 30 seconds earlier." Her voice trailed off into giggles. "So, was he everything you expected?" "Oh my God," she said with intense pleasure. "I have never, ever experienced anything quite like Frank Garrett." "He's good, huh?" "Oh, you have no idea." "Everybody was wondering why you two didn't show up for the fireworks," Candy said with a little snicker. "Fireworks?" Roxanne asked as if she wasn't aware of any fireworks. She pulled a tray out of the cabinet next to the stove and loaded it with Frank's sandwich, some chips, and a beer. "Have fun." Candy's voice faded as Roxanne disappeared up the stairs with the tray. She entered the bedroom, and Frank sat up and leaned against the headboard. Roxanne passed him the tray. "Are you sorry you missed the fireworks?" she teased as she climbed into the bed. "I didn't miss any fireworks," he said, and took a drink of his beer. The next morning, Roxanne slipped quietly out of bed, trying not to wake Frank. She headed downstairs, intent upon fixing breakfast, but wasn't sure what to make. Something told her she couldn't go wrong if she stuck with the basics. Unlike the night before, this time when she headed upstairs, the tray looked like a mini buffet that she'd topped off with a yellow rose. Quietly, she set the tray on the nightstand and eased down onto the edge of the bed. Frank didn't budge. She took the rose and brushed it lightly across the tip of his nose. His face twitched and nothing more. Again she tickled his nose. He raked his hand over his face and went back to his peaceful slumber. Roxanne giggled softly and tickled his nose again. He grabbed her wrist. "What's so funny?" he asked with closed eyes and a slight smile. "You are." His eyes opened and his gaze fell upon her. "Good morning," he said. flashing that irresistible smile of his. She got the feeling he had no idea his emotions were showing. "Morning," she grinned, a remnant from the night before. "What's on the tray?" he asked, eyeing the food. "Oh," she turned to the tray. "This is for you." She offered it to him. "Thanks." Frank eagerly turned his attention to the food. "You bring me chow last night? And again this morning?" He paused, munching on a piece of bacon. "Wish I could get this kind of service at home." She remembered he didn't live there. That wiped the smile off her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, really," she said, shaking her head. "Then why the long face?" he asked with a sorrowful look in his eyes. She looked away. "I forgot that you don't live here." She worked up the courage to look back at him. "I guess that was out of line, huh?" Roxanne got up off the bed. Fear washed over her and left her ready to run. Frank grabbed her arm. "Come back here." He pulled her down to the bed. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't I tell you last night that I love you?" "Yes." "Then why would you think you're out of line?" Beating around the bush was not something Roxanne could do with Frank. She'd better just say it and get it over with. If he shot her down, then she'd know where she stood. "Where do we go from here, Frank?" she asked. "At what point do you make that commitment and move in here?" By asking that question, she braved the answer she feared the most. "Or are you just going to get up and go home every morning?" Frank looked at Roxanne, a hint of disappointment glistening in his eyes. He smiled sadly. She fidgeted and tried to pull away from him. He wouldn't let her. "Roxy, I love you." Why was that so hard for her to understand? "I've been taking things slow, obviously, because I didn't want to rush you into anything." He gave her a wink and a smile. "And I am as afraid of rejection as you are." She rolled her eyes and laughed. "However," he cut in before she could say anything, "there's nothing I'd rather do than live here with you." He brushed her cheek with a tender caress. "Is that what you want?" She nodded. "Would you really move in here with me?" "Are you kidding?" he asked, laughing at the absurdity of her question. Moving in with Roxanne was exactly what Frank wanted. For as much as he loved her, he also wanted to be in control of their love affair. The only way he could see how to do that was to live under the same roof with her. Frank moved his things in that day. But Frank also shared an apartment with Rich, which meant they shared the rent. He didn't want to leave his friend in a bind, but how could he contribute to two households? Frank had enough trouble taking care of himself, much less anyone else. Chapter 6. During the next few months, the band's gigs remained in the general vicinity of the Tampa Bay area. On the nights Garrett Hollander played, if Roxanne didn't go with Frank, he always came straight home right after the last set. Their budding relationship grew into a strong bond almost immediately. The couple shared a happiness that neither of them had ever thought possible. Those around them got caught up in the exhilaration too, quickly identifying Frank and Roxanne as the perfect example of happily ever after. But slowly Roxanne's mood began to change. Intuition filled her head with notions of Garrett Hollander going out on the road. That brought about the primary reason she felt so disheartened. She feared being left behind by Frank. Instead of confronting her fears, she chose to lock them deep inside herself, all the while trying to pretend indifference to the whole situation. She didn't want to deal with the reality that he would possibly leave her behind. She figured that once Frank hit the road, without her, he might decide she wasn't as important to him as he'd originally thought. And rather than facing her fears, it seemed easier to convince herself that he would never do that. He would not leave her alone like Chuck had done. This time it was going to be different. This time it had to be, because this time she couldn't afford to lose.
Early in their relationship, Frank had taken Roxanne to watch the sunset at a place out on the bay called Sunset Beach. It became one of her favorite spots, and she and Candy spent many a day there soaking up the sun. On one of those occasions, after consistently witnessing Roxanne's increasing melancholy, Candy decided to voice her concerns. "Rocky," she said, "is something wrong?" "He'll be leaving soon," she said from out of nowhere. "What makes you say that?" Candy asked. "Has something happened that you haven't told me about?" "No," Roxanne said, "but he's going out on the road soon." "What?" Candy blurted out. "When are they going, and for how long?" She threw questions out at Roxanne at the speed of light, resenting Rich for not telling her. "I don't know," Roxanne said, vague. Candy hesitated for a second and realized their conversation wasn't making sense. "How can you not know when he's leaving?" She sat up. "Or how long he'll be gone?" "I'm not sure he knows he's leaving." "Well," Candy dropped back onto her beach towel, "why are you worrying over something that might not even be happening?" "Oh, it's gonna happen all right," Roxanne said calmly, yet matter-of-factly. Frank and Roxanne sat quietly, side by side, as the sun crept behind the horizon at Sunset Beach. Colorful streaks of pinks and purples filled the evening sky, and the scent of salt lingered on the gentle breeze of the sea air. Roxanne was staring at the ocean while Frank sifted sand through his fingers. The time had come for the band to go back out on the road, and Frank wanted her to go with him, but he wasn't sure if she'd be willing to go without Candy, and he didn't see Candy agreeing to go anyplace. Finally, he convinced himself to say something. "The band has to go back out on the road." "I know," she said softly. "How do you know that?" He didn't know which surprised him more, the fact that she knew or the quiet in her tone. Roxanne shook her head. "I don't know. Intuition or something?" "It's my job," he felt the need to say. "It's what I do." "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "We'll be gone till about April." Anxiety made a brief appearance, and he cleared it out of his throat. "I was hoping you'd come with me." "Really?" She flung him a skeptical look. Frank tilted his head and shrugged. "I guess I assumed that you'd want to go." He hadn't considered the fact that she might not, and he found that notion extremely unsettling. Wanting to go and not going because of Candy were two entirely different things. Roxanne had to want to go with him, because if she didn't, it would ruin everything. "Oh, I do," she said quickly. "Of course I'll go with you." Frank pressed his lips to hers, caressing her mouth more than kissing it. His fears, apparently unfounded, blew away with the wind. Rich perched himself on the corner of Candy's bed, unable to relax. The longer she stayed in the corner near the bathroom door, the more his confidence deserted him. "Well, Roxy is going with Frank." He put forth the only argument he could think of. "So why can't you go with me?" Number one, she crossed her arms in front of her and leaned against the wall. "I don't think it's a good idea. And secondly, I don't have the money to go traipsing all over the country." Slowly, she let her eyes travel to and settle on him. "And I'm not going to ask Roxanne to pay my way either." He pushed himself into a standing position and glanced around the room. When his attention settled back on her once again, he said, "Okay." As if there was nothing left to say, he shrugged his shoulders in mock resignation, then turned and headed for the door. The door slammed shut and she jumped. Damn it. Roxanne preparing to leave with Frank was Candy's cue that it was time to get herself a job. For convenience's sake, she accepted a waitressing position at a local restaurant that was close to home. If she was lucky, the tips would be good too. "So?" Roxanne lounged casually against the wall that opened to the stairs. When do you start your new job? Candy twisted around on the couch and draped her arm over the back. I told them I could start next week. Sure you don't want to go with us? Roxanne pushed off the wall and moved to the couch, dropping down beside Candy. It's not a good idea. Candy turned back around and tucked her feet up under her. It'll give Rich the wrong impression. Maybe you've got the wrong impression. I'm going to be fine. Listen. Roxanne snatched her purse off the coffee table and dug around inside it. Do me a favor, she said, handing Candy a bank book. Candy fanned through the wallet-sized ledger. 25 grand. Was she serious? I don't want your money, Roxanne. She handed back the bank book. Look, I just want you to go out and buy a car. Roxanne refused to take the ledger back. A nice little sports job, she said. One you'd enjoy driving around. I don't need you to buy me a car. How are you going to get around while I'm gone? I'll walk. Or I'll take a cab. I'll manage. Your brother would never forgive me. Roxanne knew her weak spots. It wouldn't do Candy any good to argue with her. Once she made up her mind, she wouldn't stop until she got her way. Candy let out a defeated sigh. I'm putting the car in your name. Whatever, Roxanne shrugged. It didn't matter to her so long as she got her way.